She purchased a stranger for $1 to see herself through the winter months. He spoke her name as if he had known her very soul. Alone, expecting a child, and with 2 young ones to safeguard, she had no inkling of what lay ahead. The settlement was hardly a town. It consisted of merely 3 structures, a dilapidated church devoid of any bell, and a saloon that also functioned as a boarding house, and even more disturbingly, a place no respectable woman should be found. The wind swept through with a brutal force, intent on stripping flesh from bone, carrying with it dust and the premature promise of snowfall. Marbeth Grayley kept her hands concealed within the worn folds of her shawl, her burgeoning belly hidden beneath the fabric, her back protesting the vast distance she had traversed and the ever-increasing heaviness of the silence that invariably descended whenever she encountered men. 2 children walked beside her, their cheeks flushed from the cold, their eyes flicking toward any passing shadow. Joanna, a girl of barely 8, clutched her younger brother's hand with the solemnity of someone much older. Matthew, at 5 years old, had not uttered a word in 3 days. They had departed Kansas 2 weeks before the first frost arrived. Their departure was prompted by the death of her husband, a victim of a banker's firearm, and the local preacher's decree that it was unsuitable for a woman alone to continue cultivating farmland that no longer legally belonged to her. Unsuitable, as if sorrow itself adhered to a strict code of etiquette. She had secured passage as far as the cattle trails allowed, then continued on foot, relying on fleeting acts of generosity, often with unspoken expectations or no kindness at all. But this desolate place, by some divine irony, offered something no other location would dare to, a man for purchase. It wasn't akin to slavery, not in the true sense. That practice had been abolished with the war's end. This was different. A notice had been posted several weeks prior, affixed to a wooden post, much like a sacred text splintered into pieces. Man from the mountains seeking lawful occupation, willing to exchange services for winter shelter, a $1 contract, terms open to negotiation, no inquiries necessary. Most of the town's inhabitants had scoffed at the announcement. They believed that if a man could not earn his keep through his own efforts, he was not worth the effort of chopping firewood. However, Marbeth recognized it for what it truly represented, an answer, not merely to her gnawing hunger or her children's shivering forms, but to the oppressive silence that encroached with each passing day. The presence of a man in their dwelling signified protection. It offered the hope that they might endure until spring. The transaction was concluded without any formality. A single folded dollar was passed into the hand of a man whose appearance was more elemental than human. Broad shoulders were encased in a wool coat worn smooth in places, a thick dark beard concealed his lower face, and his grey unreadable eyes were shadowed beneath the brim of a slouch hat. He spoke little, offered no smile, simply regarded her and the children, and gave a single nod. "What is your name?" she inquired, as they loaded her meagre possessions onto a borrowed wagon. One wheel gave a protesting crack, and one of the children began to cough. The man paused, then replied, "I suspect you'll know it soon enough." They departed the settlement before twilight, the road snaking between stark, leafless trees and decaying fences. The silence shared between them was not strained, but rather held a palpable weight, as if anticipating a revelation. The wagon creaked ominously beneath them, and in the distance the mountain loomed like the slumbering form of some colossal beast. The air was so frigid that breaths emerged as mist and fingers grew numb, yet Marbeth remained silent. She was preserving her words, conserving her strength for what lay ahead. By the time the sun descended behind the mountain ridge, they reached the cabin. It was larger than she had anticipated, 2 rooms, a loft, and smoke already curling from the chimney. Whatever his background, he had not deceived her about providing shelter. He assisted her down with a careful, deliberate movement, ensuring no physical contact. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished but comfortably warm. A low fire crackled, and the lingering scent of stew hung in the air like a cherished memory. He indicated the cot, the hearth, and a shelf stocked with canned goods. He offered no explanations, for none were needed. The children succumbed to sleep almost immediately, nestled together beneath quilts she did not recognize. Marbeth sat by the fire, her gaze fixed on the flames, until a subtle movement within her abdomen served as a reminder of her condition. He spoke then from the dimness. "You are too slender for a woman so advanced in her pregnancy." She did not startle, merely nodded. "I have been walking for a considerable duration." "Do you have a plan for the birth?" he inquired. "No," her voice faltered. "Do you?" He did not reply immediately. "A midwife resides a week's journey south. Snow arrives early. You will not be able to reach her." Marbeth met his gaze, and for the first time a discernible emotion flickered within his eyes. It was not pity nor desire, but perhaps recognition. She offered no further words, and neither did he. That night she remained awake long after the fire had dwindled, listening to the wind's mournful whistle through the cracks in the logs and the steady respiration of the man who had no name. She questioned whether she had made an error, whether a solitary woman could ever afford the luxury of trust. But this was not about trust, it was about survival. In the morning she found him outside, engaged in splitting wood, his breath forming white plumes in the frigid air. The children were still asleep. She stood on the porch, observing him, her shawl pulled tightly around her. When he noticed her, he did not cease his work, but spoke between the forceful blows of the axe. "You possess a resilient frame for someone carrying 3. She did not correct him. "The infant counts, even if it is not yet mobile." "Do you have a name?" he asked after a moment. "Marbth?" He froze, the axe suspended mid-swing. His eyes met hers, sharp and suddenly alert. "Marbth Grayley." A chilling sensation washed over her. "How do you know that?" He slowly lowered the axe, remaining silent for a moment before speaking with a quietude akin to settling snow. "Because you once prayed my name, and I heard you." She staggered back a step, her hand instinctively flying to her belly as if to shield herself. He remained motionless, offering no explanation, but his expression conveyed something she had not witnessed in a very long time: certainty. Inside, the children began to stir. Outside, the sky darkened ominously, signaling the approach of snow once more. Marbeth remained silent for a spell. She stood frozen on the edge of the porch, her breath shallow, her eyes fixed on the man who had just uttered her name as if he had cherished it for years. Her mind raced, sifting through fragmented memories of faces, voices, and names. But his name, it was absent. He was absent from her recollections, yet the manner in which he had spoken, it caused her knees to weaken and her stomach to churn, not with fear, but with a strange resonant familiarity that struck her to the core. He did not press her, nor did he avert his gaze, instead turning back to the chopping block and driving the axe down once more, cleaving a thick log with a sharp crack that shattered the silence as if it were brittle bone. Inside, the children were beginning to stir. She heard Matthew's sleepy whimper and Joanna's soft murmur of reassurance. Marbeth blinked, regaining her composure, and stepped back into the cabin, closing the door softly behind her. The warmth within seemed less substantial than it had the previous night, or perhaps it was merely her nerves fraying. Joanna rubbed her eyes, her hair a dishevelled tangle of straw and sleep. "Mamma, where are we?" Marbeth knelt and drew both children into a close embrace. "Somewhere safe," she whispered, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. They were perhaps true, or perhaps merely an expression of hope. Later, while the children sat near the fire, consuming watered-down stew from chipped bowls, Marbeth stood at the window, watching him. He moved with the inherent stillness of the mountain itself, silent, unyielding, essential. Now her eyes traced the details she had overlooked in her haste, driven by cold and necessity. The aged scar on his knuckles, the way he constantly glanced toward the ridge whenever the wind shifted, as if anticipating an arrival. When he finally returned, his arms laden with freshly split wood, she stepped aside without a word. He stacked the logs near the hearth, brushed the snow from his shoulders, and sat at the small table, as if undertaking a task he had been postponing. Marbeth ladled the remaining stew into a bowl and placed it before him. He ate without raising his eyes, his hands steady, his movements unhurried. "You said I prayed your name," she stated quietly. He swallowed, set down his spoon, and met her gaze. "You did?" she asked. "I do not recall." "You were 17, behind a derelict chapel outside Ellensburg. You were wounded." The air seemed to leave her lungs. Her hand sought the edge of the table for support. "That was—" she began, then stopped. She had not spoken of that night in 10 years, not to anyone. She believed it had perished with the decaying timber walls and the man who had abandoned her there. "I was not there by chance," he said. "I found you. You do not remember me because I did not permit you to." She stared at him, her heart pounding. "Why?" "Because I was also fleeing," he replied. There it was. No theatrics, no elaborate explanation, just that simple declaration, and suddenly her legs gave out. She sank onto the bench opposite him, her eyes burning. "You left me," she said, the accusation devoid of heat, simply a statement of fact. "I saved you," he countered, a hard edge now in his voice. "And I carried you to the widow Haynes's farm, told her you required medical attention, and then I departed." "Why?" He looked past her, then toward the flames. "Because I was not prepared to be seen." Silence stretched between them like a chasm, profound and filled with unspoken sentiments. The children continued to eat, oblivious to the mounting tension that unraveled like aged twine. She struggled to reconcile the memory of pain, fire and blood, the desperate prayer she had whispered into the ashes with the man seated before her, yet something in his eyes compelled her to believe him. He was not fabricating the truth. She knew that with absolute certainty. "What is your name?" she asked. His gaze met hers. "Clay Maddox." The revelation struck her with the force of a thunderclap. She had not heard that name in over a decade. She knew it from the hushed stories. The notorious outlaw who vanished after a botched shootout, the man some claimed had robbed a train, while others swore he had rescued a dozen children from a blaze in Texas. The veracity of these tales remained unknown, and yet here he was, building fires and chopping wood as if absolution could be earned one splinter at a time. "You should not have told me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know." She felt a surge of anger, a desire to demand an explanation for his prolonged silence, for his tardiness in revealing himself. But all she could perceive was the relentless march of time, the vast chasm of years separating them, and the inexplicable movement of her unborn child within her, as if it too sensed the profound shift in the room. That night sleep eluded her. The breeze had intensified, and the aged cabin groaned, as if recalling tempestuous times from bygone eras. She rested on her side, her back throbbing, one hand splayed across her abdomen. Across the chamber, Clay occupied a spot near the dwindling embers, meticulously shaping a wooden block with his carving tool. The rasping sound was deliberate and possessed a peculiar serenity, akin to the relentless tick of a timepiece that had remained indifferent to their individual journeys. "You mentioned you were escaping," she voiced into the obscurity. "Escaping what?" he inquired, his carving implement halting its progress. "Myself," he responded, "and from the deeds I committed." She refrained from further questioning. She understood the burden of carrying a guilt too profound for articulation. Instead, she turned her countenance toward the wall, allowing the rhythm of his blade to guide her towards slumber. The subsequent days fell into a discernible cadence. Clay busied himself with felling timber, procuring whatever game he could forage, and maintaining a reserved demeanor. The children gradually warmed to his presence. Joanna began posing questions about the flora, inquiring about the most effective methods for snaring rabbits. Matthew trailed him assiduously, mirroring his movements in a silent imitation. Clay never imposed himself, nor did he ever raise his voice, yet subtly, almost imperceptibly, the cabin began to acquire a more homely feel. Marbeth performed the laundry using water from melted snow, prepared sustenance from the provisions Clay brought back, and endeavoured to put the past out of her mind. Nevertheless, on occasion, she would catch him observing her. His gaze was not of the predatory sort men had previously directed at her, presuming an entitlement, but rather resembled someone trying to retrieve a memory that had not entirely vanished. One evening, as the fire diminished and the youngsters had already succumbed to sleep, he spoke. "I hadn't realized it was you," he confessed. "Not when I posted the notice." She raised her head from her mending. "But you remembered. Only after you disclosed your name?" She nodded slowly. "Why did you depart once more after aiding me?" His hands tightened around the carving. "Because I was barely a man then. I believed my presence would only bring you detriment. And now I'm uncertain of my present state, but I know I would not abandon you again." There it was, a commitment previously unspoken, a delicate connection woven between them. However, destiny has a peculiar way of eavesdropping when one begins to embrace tranquility. It transpired 2 mornings hence. Clay had gone to inspect his trap lines. Marbeth was retrieving blankets from the upper storage when the dog erupted in a sharp, agitated bark, sending a chill down her spine. She hurried to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Riders, 3 of them, ascended the incline, resembling phantoms astride their mounts. Her breath caught in her throat. These were not local folk, nor were they vagrants. These individuals bore an air of resolute purpose, like a suit of armor. And one among them, may Providence have mercy on her, possessed a face she recognized. Clay reappeared moments later, his rifle clutched in his hand, his eyes already displaying a hardened expression. "Do you know them?" he inquired. She gave a slight nod, her voice parched. "The one who is tall is called EMTT Case. He rode with the individual who ended my husband's life." Clay's jaw tightened. "Are they here for you or for me?" she asked. "Both," he replied without a moment's hesitation. The children stood behind her, silent and wide-eyed. She looked at Clay, truly looked at him, and for the first time apprehension did not seize her heart. Not because the peril was illusory, but because for the initial instance she no longer felt isolated. The riders did not advance. They circled the ridge like carrion birds, anticipating their prey's demise. Their outlines were stark against the pale sky, dark and motionless, their horses restive beneath them. From within the cabin's confines, Marbeth could just discern the gleam of a long rifle slung across the back of the tallest figure, EMTT Case. He had altered little since she last saw him, amidst the smoke of her burning barn and the ruin of a life he had contributed to destroying. His very presence unsettled her, not from fear, but from a profound anger, the sort that lies dormant until provoked by something sharp and unwelcome. Clay stood by the window, as silent as ever, assessing the situation. He made no restless movements, no nervous gestures. He simply observed. Joanna remained close to her mother's skirts, while Matthew stayed behind the table, his small fists clenched at his sides. Marbeth could sense the atmosphere growing heavy, danger creeping insidiously and patiently around the cabin's edges like encroaching mist. "What is our course of action?" she inquired, her voice hushed. Clay's response was direct. "Wait." It seemed an insufficient strategy, yet his composure offered her a measure of stability. He possessed knowledge she lacked, or perhaps he simply remained unruffled. Regardless, she placed her trust in him. They spent the ensuing hour in a state of tense anticipation, preparing as best they could. Clay reloaded his rifle, retrieved the revolver concealed beneath the floorboards, and presented her with a shotgun that predated her own existence. He did not inquire about her proficiency with it. There was no need for her to confirm her ability. "I can escort the children to the concealed space beneath the root cellar," she stated, observing his expression. He inclined his head. "Only if they commence firing. Otherwise, we must keep them within our sight." Joanna's small, trembling hands sought out Marbith's. "Are they wicked men, Mama?" She chose honesty. "Yes." Clay's gaze flickered back to the door. "They will not fire the first shot. Individuals of that nature desire to instill fear before they seek to extinguish life." "How do you know?" He met her eyes, and for the first time since he had spoken her name on the porch, Marbith detected a subtle hint within him that sent a shiver down her spine, a residual trace of his former self. "Because I once rode with men of that ilk." She should have felt a sting of bitterness at this revelation, but she didn't, for whatever he had been then, he was no longer. And the man now standing between her and those approaching riders was no longer one who would flee from bloodshed. Dusk was drawing near when the rapping commenced. Not urgent, not forceful, merely 3 subdued knocks, as if performing a perfunctory act, like someone too proud to acknowledge the possibility of rejection. Clay cautiously opened the door, rifle at the ready. Marbith positioned herself just behind him, shotgun lowered but prepared. EMTTK stood on the threshold, dusk settling upon his coat, his eyes gleaming with an unshakable self-assurance. "Well now," EMTT drawled, glancing past Clay towards Marbith, "what a reunion this is." She remained silent. Clay did likewise. EMTT shifted his weight, his gloved hand resting casually on his hip, close to the handle of his sidearm. "We've journeyed from Fort Nelson. Word reached us of a woman residing out here with 2 children and something of considerable value in her possession." "I don't observe any valuables," Clay responded, his tone devoid of emotion. "Oh, I beg to differ," EMTT replied, a smile now gracing his lips. "You see, that woman's husband was indebted to us. He departed too swiftly to settle his accounts, but a debt does not cease to exist simply because the debtor has passed, and now we're informed she's been associating with a phantom." Clay's grip on the rifle remained unchanged, but the atmosphere within the cabin transformed, becoming dense and charged with anticipation. "You will not take her," he declared. EMTT emitted a low chuckle. "We're not here to abduct anyone. Our sole purpose is to collect." Marbith stepped forward, her gaze steely. "You have no claim on me." "That infant within your womb suggests otherwise," EMTT stated. Her breath caught in her throat. Clay raised the rifle slightly. "You will depart now." EMTT held his position, his smile unyielding. "Are you prepared to take a man's life in the presence of a lady and her children?" "If you compel me to," Clay affirmed, his voice as cold as iron. A protracted silence ensued between them. Then Emmett tipped his hat and retreated a step. "We shall grant you the night. Consider your options. Come morning, we shall return to claim what is owed." He turned, issued a whistle, and the other 2 men followed him down the path, their horses' hooves clattering against stone and ice. The instant they vanished beyond the tree line, Clay secured the door and bolted it. Marbith felt the oppressive weight ease from her lungs. "They will not wait until morning," she stated. "No," Clay confirmed, "they will not." He moved with haste, then placed the children in the far room, providing them with sustenance and stern instructions not to emerge unless they heard his voice. He stoked the fire, meticulously reloaded every firearm, and positioned a series of small bells on a thread strung across the perimeter of the trees. "You've experienced this before," she observed, watching his hands. "Far too often." "Why are they truly here?" "They wish to see me humiliated," he replied, "and they believe causing you harm is the means to achieve that." Marbith suppressed her mounting dread. "Why?" He finally met her gaze, and the truth, though spoken quietly, was devastating. Because I once inflicted the same upon another. She did not solicit further details. She felt no need. The manner in which he bore this past was narrative enough. Whatever transgressions Clay Maddox had committed, he had carried their burden long before their paths had converged. And now, by some turn of fate, it was resurfacing. That night, sleep eluded them. She remained by the hearth, shotgun resting on her lap, her gaze fixed upon the fire. Clay moved between the windows like a vigilant sentry. When the children finally succumbed to exhaustion, he joined her, his eyes etched with fatigue. "I departed because I believed you would fare better without a man like me," he confessed abruptly. "Yet I never ceased to think of you. With every step I took, your voice echoed in my mind." She looked at him, at the stark lines of his face, now softened by the firelight and his candid admission. "You rescued me. That holds significance." His eyes gleamed. "My intention is to do so again." Before she could respond, a sound pierced the stillness, soft yet distinct. The metallic chime of one of the bells. Clay rose instantly, rifle prepared. Marbeth moved with him, a tightness in her throat. Another bell chimed, then a third. "They are here," Clay stated. They braced themselves, but the initial shot did not strike the window. It emanated from the trees, high and sharp, a warning shot that embedded itself in the porch post. Clay opened the door a mere fraction, peered out, and then forcefully slammed it shut. "They possess torches," he reported. A second shot impacted the side of the cabin, showering the interior with splinters of wood. Marbeth retrieved Joanna and Matthew from the rear room and guided them into the crawl space beneath the floorboards. Joanna clutched her doll. Matthew remained silent. His fear was too profound for tears. The front window imploded. Clay returned fire with precision and speed, forcing one assailant to take cover behind the barn. Marbeth watched the rear window, her finger resting on the trigger. "They're attempting to flush us out," he murmured, his eyes scanning the surrounding shadows. "They intend to set fire to us." She did not inquire about the subsequent action. She already knew. It would be swift or protracted, but in either scenario it would involve fire and bloodshed if they remained huddled there like defenseless creatures. Clay seemed to arrive at the same conclusion. "I will draw them away," he declared. "Take the rear path along the creek. If I can guide them to safety, you can escort the children south." Marbeth shook her head firmly. "I am not leaving without you." He moved closer, gently placing a hand on her cheek. "You do not owe me anything, Marbeth." She firmly grasped his wrist. "I refuse to simply endure existence any longer. Not again." His eyes shut, his jaw tightened. Then he gave a decisive nod. "We will see this through to the end." The final assault came simultaneously. All three adversaries attempted to storm the doorway together, believing their superior numbers would easily overcome him. Their estimation was incorrect. Clay emerged first, his rifle unleashing a thunderous roar. One man collapsed, a piercing scream escaping his lips. Marbeth fired from the window, striking another assailant in the thigh. EMTT reached the porch just as Clay tackled him to the ground, unleashing a barrage of punches. The confrontation was savage and swift, utterly devoid of any grace. Two men who had lived lives of excessive hardship for far too long were now desperately trying to end the other before their strength gave out. Ultimately, it was Marab who brought the struggle to a halt. EMTT reached for his sidearm. She stepped from the cabin, shotgun leveled at his chest. "Do not," she stated. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on hers. Then a perceptible shift occurred on his face. It was not fear, but comprehension. "You always possessed more fortitude than he did," he remarked. Following that, Clay struck him one last time, and the battle concluded. They committed the bodies to the earth at dawn. Clay excavated the graves in complete silence. Marbeth also remained wordless, merely standing with the children, her abdomen tight with unease and the profound weight of all that had just transpired. Once the task was finished, they settled on the porch, observing the morning frost recede from the pine trees. "Are you going to ask me to depart?" he inquired finally. She responded with a shake of her head. "Not if your words about remaining here permanently still hold true." He regarded her then, and in his eyes she perceived something she had not dared to hope for since the day she laid her first husband to rest. Something dependable, something secure. "I do," he affirmed. She extended her hand, taking his, and for the first time in years it felt as though springtime might indeed arrive after all. The days following the skirmish passed in a haze of residual effects, cold and a quietude, punctuated only by the sharp crack of wood being split or the gentle murmur of the children's voices attempting to reclaim a semblance of peace. The deceased had long since been interred, the blood vanquished by creek water and melted snow, yet the gravity of the events persisted, even within the comforting glow of the firelight or the fleeting smile that touched Joanna's lips as she assisted with stirring the stew. The spectres of that night lingered nearby. Marbeth found herself observing Clay more than she intended. He had undergone a transformation she hadn't anticipated, not broken or hardened, but rather steadied. He made no mention of the confrontation. He did not speak of EMTT or the person he had been previously, but the change was palpable. He now moved with a more subdued purpose. And although he continued to rise before daybreak and venture into the wilderness before breakfast, he invariably returned, always, and that alone began to effect a change within her. The children, too, started to evolve. Matthew, once reticent and observant, began to speak again in soft, intermittent bursts. He posed questions, pointed at birds, and started to follow Clay in the manner that young boys do when they begin to perceive men not as strangers, but as figures worthy of emulation. Joanna, ever earnest, spent more time alongside Marth, posing thoughtful, probing inquiries about the baby and the path forward. She did not inquire about her father, and Marth did not volunteer information. That particular chapter had concluded with gunfire and smoke. All of them had new narratives to compose now. One morning, after a night of intense frost and profound stillness, Marbeth stood behind the cabin, observing the sun ascend slowly over the distant mountain range. Her hands rested on her abdomen, and she felt the infant shift, a delicate flutter rather than a forceful kick. It drew a breath from her, a subtle reminder that even amidst the chill, something warm and alive continued to stir within her. "You can feel it." Clay's voice was low, spoken from behind her. She did not turn, simply inclined her head. "It possesses strength," he added after a brief pause. "At times it feels excessively vigorous," she replied. "It feels as though it's attempting to force its way out. Do you have a name in mind?" A faint smile touched her lips. "I have been contemplating that." Clay moved to stand beside her, his coat brushing against hers. "I was given a name at birth that I never particularly favored. People wielded it like a threat. Clay Maddox signified something different in every settlement, and none of it positive." She turned to face him. "That appellation preserved me once." His eyes softened. "It will safeguard you again." They did not discuss the future extensively. The conflict between what could be and what had been remained too raw. However, something in their quiet shared moments began to bridge that chasm, weaving a sense of security into the hours in ways she had not experienced since before Kansas turned its back on her. The snow arrived earlier that year, heavy, dry flakes that draped the valley in a blanket of white and hushed the world into silence. Clay replenished the fire each night, making it burn higher. Marbeth diligently gathered the remaining provisions and distributed them with meticulous care. The children assisted with minor tasks, their boots crunching in the snow as they collected firewood or brushed frost from the window panes. Then, on a bleak morning characterized by low-hanging clouds and a biting wind, the labor commenced. It began without any prior indication. One moment, Marbeth was meticulously shelling dried beans at the table, and the next, her breath caught and her body folded in half, seized by a pain that radiated from her spine to her ribs. She gripped the table with such force that her knuckles turned pale. Joanna was the first to notice. "Mama!" Marbeth slowly straightened, her breathing rapid. "It is time," she whispered. Clay reacted with astonishing speed, moving faster than she had ever witnessed him. He cleared the table, added extra logs to the fire, and guided the children to the adjacent room. Joanna initially voiced her objection, but Marapth soothed her with a gentle touch. "It is all right," she managed to say through clenched teeth. "He will ensure our safety." Clay assisted her onto the cot, his touch firm yet tender. She did not cry out in pain. There was no need. The tempest of suffering escalating within her was more potent than any vocalization. The hours dissolved into a blur, time contorted and fractured under the sheer intensity of each contraction. Clay remained steadfastly at her side. He ensured the water remained hot, the fire burned steadily, and her hand was held tightly within his. At one point, the pain overwhelmed her so profoundly that she wept, her sobs muffled against the wool of his coat as he held her upright, murmuring reassurances that she was strong, that she could endure this, that he was not going anywhere. And then a profound silence descended, preceding the infant's first cry. A lengthy interval extended enough to momentarily steal her breath, but then, sharp and high as a celestial summons, the baby wailed. Clay let out a laugh, a genuine, resonant, broken, joyful sound that shattered the somber atmosphere of the night. He carefully wrapped the infant in a soft cloth and gently placed her into Marbath's embrace. "She is perfect," he declared, his voice thick with emotion. Marapth gazed at the newborn, noting her dark hair, her robust lungs, and her tightly clenched fists. Tears streamed down her face then, not from pain, but from a profound sense of awe and liberation. "She has your eyes," she managed to say. Clay knelt beside the cot, tenderly brushing a stray lock of damp hair from Marbath's forehead. "She possesses your spirit." They did not bestow a name upon the baby that night. It was unnecessary. The infant's presence illuminated the cabin like a beacon. Joanna and Matthew cautiously emerged after the crying ceased, their eyes wide and their breath held in anticipation. Marbeth permitted them to hold her, one at a time, tears flowing freely down Joanna's cheeks as she whispered affectionate words to her newfound sister. The ensuing days unfolded with a peculiar sense of tranquility. The snowfall intensified, but it no longer felt harsh or unforgiving. The baby, whom they eventually christened Clara, spent more time sleeping than crying, her tiny chest rhythmically rising and falling in time with the comforting crackle of the fire. Marbath's movements were slower, her body aching and stiff, but with each step she took, she seemed to grow more resolute. Clay remained close, attending to their needs without being overbearing. He prepared meals, tidied the dwelling, chopped wood, and fetched whatever was required. He held Clara with an innate tenderness, cradling her with the same careful precision he employed when handling a rifle, his touch both gentle and assured. Marbath found herself observing him once more, this time not with apprehension or bewilderment, but with a profounder emotion, something more difficult to articulate. One evening, after the children had retired to sleep, and Clara was nestled securely between them, she sat beside Clay at the table, the lamp casting a soft flickering glow between them. "You could have departed," she stated, "after the confrontation, after the birth. I could have," he conceded, "but you chose not to." He met her gaze. "I had been fleeing for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand still. Then I discovered you." Marbeth blinked, fighting back the warmth that had gathered behind her eyes. "You have rescued me on 2 occasions now." Clay gently shook his head. "No, you are the one who saved me this time." A comfortable silence settled between them, now familiar and welcome. She reached across the table, her fingers grazing his. He did not recoil. Instead, he turned his hand palm upwards, allowing her to intertwine her fingers with his. The winter season persisted, The snow accumulated to depths exceeding the height of the windowsills. Provisions dwindled, but never completely vanished. They managed their resources, meticulously planned, and worked collaboratively. Marabith's strength returned. Clay diligently repaired a damaged sled and crafted new boots for the children from salvaged animal hide. There was no immediate assurance of spring's arrival, not yet. However, a palpable warmth emanated from their shared activities, their unspoken understanding, their instinctual inclination to draw closer to one another. One night, as the wind howled relentlessly against the cabin, and the fire's glow had diminished, Marth stirred awake to the soft sound of Clay humming a low, melancholic tune. She sat up, startled, and found him cradling Clara near the hearth, the melody ancient and imbued with a deep sense of longing. He noticed her watching him. "My mother used to sing this," he explained. "She is still alive." "No, not for a considerable time." Marbeth rose and approached him. She gently touched Clara's back, then rested her cheek against his shoulder. She would be proud. He swallowed hard. "I am uncertain if I merit any of this." She turned him to face her. "You do. You have rightfully earned it with every day you have remained." Clay looked at her, his eyes reflecting a profound emotion, almost akin to apprehension. "I love you," he confessed. The words emerged from a place deep within him, untouched by the passage of time or any lingering regret. Marbeth did not hesitate. "I know," she replied. "I have known that since you spoke my name on that porch." He kissed her then, a kiss that was neither hurried nor desperate, but slow and steady, like that of a man who had endured a lengthy wait and was disinclined to squander even a single moment more. The tempest raged outside, but within the cabin a profound sense of stability prevailed. The snow began to melt during the final week of March. The deep freeze did not release its grip all at once, no grand capitulation, but rather surrendered its hold piecemeal, melting from the edges of the eaves, weeping from the laden pine branches, and dripping from the corroded hinges of the shed door that had remained shut since the first significant snowfall. Icicles transformed into trickles, and the breeze began to once again carry the fragrance of the soil, a damp, potent aroma, brimming with the promise of emergent life. Marbeth stood one morning on the porch, her feet bare, with Clara cradled close to her chest, observing the world as it underwent its transformation. The air retained a certain coolness, but its biting harshness had vanished. Beside her, Joanna was in pursuit of Matthew down the gentle incline behind their dwelling, their mirth echoing as it had not since their time in Kansas, as if it had been patiently awaiting the arrival of spring. Within the cabin, Clay sat at the sturdy table, painstakingly repairing a torn strap on one of Joanna's boots, his brow creased in deep concentration. He had cultivated a habit of mending things with the quiet reverence some men reserve for prayer. Following the long, arduous winter, the cabin bore clear indications of their struggle for survival. Scuff marks marred the wooden floor, testament to the frequent use of the rocking chair. Scorched patches near the hearth recalled a night when the fire had momentarily raged out of control, and faint chalk lines, etched by Matthew's diligent measurement of his height every few weeks, adorned the back wall, though he consistently forgot to clear away the older markings. Later that afternoon, Marbeth discovered Clay down by the creek, diligently rolling up lengths of fencing wire he had salvaged from the ruined enclosure that had once housed goats, years before either of them had ever set foot near this remote cabin. He looked up as she approached, his eyes squinting against the bright sunlight, and offered a smile. It remained a rare expression for him, yet it no longer carried the connotation of something being merely borrowed. "Considering acquiring some livestock?" she inquired, folding her arms, Clara slumbering peacefully against her shoulder. He replied that he was contemplating what lay ahead. Marbeth tilted her head. "What does that look like?" Clay hesitated, his gaze falling to the bundle nestled in her arms. "I've spent a long time anticipating something breaking," he admitted. "Fences, people, promises, but this," he gestured towards the cabin, "the the surrounding land, and the distant sound of children's laughter drifting from the hillside. This is the first thing I truly don't wish to lose. Marbeth remained silent for a considerable moment before stepping closer, her free hand reaching out to brush his arm. "Then hold on to it," she said simply. The thaw had ushered in more than just a change in temperature. It had brought a resurgence of activity and sound. Travellers now traversed the valley, some mounted on horseback, others guiding wagons laden with provisions, people, or an unnerving silence. Most continued on their journey without pausing. A select few, however, did stop, requesting water, directions, or simply something warmer than what they had endured. Clay attended to them with the same measured watchfulness he had displayed on that initial day he met Marbeth, his hand habitually resting near his belt, his gaze constantly sweeping the horizon, even when his back was turned. One particular individual lingered for an extended period. Late one evening, as Marbeth was in the process of lighting the oil lamps and the children were gathered around the hearth, engrossed in stories that Joanna had partially fabricated, Clay opened the door to find a tall figure standing just beyond the porch. The stranger was without a coat, clad only in a worn vest and a thin wool shirt that was thoroughly soaked from the rain. His boots were frayed to the very stitching, and a revolver hung loosely from one hip, conspicuously untethered. Marbeth stepped forward upon seeing Clay's unease, but he gently raised a hand, halting her advance. "May I come in?" the stranger inquired, his voice low and raspy, like the sound of shifting gravel. He explained that he was searching for a man they had once known as Maddox, believing he might have passed through this area. Marbeth's posture stiffened. Clay remained motionless. "There's no Maddox here," he stated calmly. The stranger's eyes flickered past Clay, drawn to the warm glow of the firelight. "Are you quite certain? He used to run with Empt Finch. They say he's turned his life around now, living as a family man, but some obligations don't simply disappear with the snow." Clay stepped fully onto the porch. "That is old business, and it is concluded." The stranger gave a dismissive shrug. "The thing is, I don't have a family, so I have time to spare." Marbeth held her breath, feeling Clara stir against her chest. Joanna stood behind the table, her hand resting reassuringly on Matthew's shoulder. Clay met the stranger's gaze directly, then stated with unwavering composure, "You will turn around and depart now, because if you decide to return, I will not afford you the courtesy of a knock." The man offered a smile, a slow, thin curve that failed to reach his eyes. He then turned and vanished back into the encompassing darkness, leaving behind only the palpable weight of his unspoken threat embedded in the damp earth. That night, Clay sat by the fire long after the others had retired, his rifle resting across his knees, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames, yet his mind was clearly perceiving something far beyond them. Marbeth did not disturb him. She merely brought him a warm blanket, bestowed a kiss upon the crown of his head, and returned to bed. Clara nestled snugly beside her. The following morning, the children discovered a rabbit caught in one of Clay's old snares. For the first time since their recent confrontation, Matthew eagerly volunteered to assist in preparing the catch. Marbeth watched from the porch, the baby in her arms, as the young boy knelt beside Clay, peppering him with questions and never once showing any aversion to his answers. That evening, they cooked the rabbit over an open flame, its savoury aroma drifting through the valley like a quiet assurance of permanence. After their meal, as the sun began its descent, casting the last rays of light upon the glistening edges of the melting snow, Marbeth and Clay sat together by the fire, Clara asleep in her mother's embrace. "I want to stay," she declared suddenly. "I want this place to be our home." Clay looked at her, his brow furrowed. "It already is." "No," she corrected softly. "I mean, I want to build it, not just reside in someone else's cabin. I want it to be uniquely ours." Clay remained quiet for a long while. Then he nodded. "Spring is arriving. We'll construct something far better." And so they did. In the ensuing weeks, they dismantled the decaying shed, carefully salvaging any usable materials. Clay meticulously marked out measurements for the new beams and support structures, while Marbeth contributed by mixing the mortar with her bare hands. Joanna diligently carried nails in an old tin, and Matthew applied a protective coating of pine tar to the walls to ward off the persistent dampness. They laboured side by side, their perspiration mingling with shared laughter, their weariness dissolving into a palpable sense of purpose. Yet the lingering memory of that unsettling stranger remained. Marbeth observed Clay casting more frequent glances towards the distant ridge. She noticed the unconscious twitch of his right hand towards his hip at unexpected moments, and how he had resumed sleeping closer to the door. One evening, under a sky thick with stars and a wind devoid of any menace, she placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "We can depart if you feel it is necessary." He turned to face her. "I will not flee any longer, but I will ensure your safety." "I know," she whispered. That night she lay awake long after the children had fallen into a deep slumber, tracing gentle circles on Clara's back and listening to the steady rhythm of Clay's breathing beside her. And for the first time her thoughts turned to prayer, not for escape, nor for mere survival, but for a future, a genuine future. A future where Clara would grow tall and strong, where Matthew would master the art of hunting, where Joanna's smiles would become more frequent than not, where Clay's past would be unable to locate them, and where their home would be a sanctuary that no one could ever seize. However, she understood that prayers did not always arrive in quietude. Sometimes they announced themselves with the sound of hooves on gravel, with the acrid scent of sulphur, or with the sharp crack of gunfire piercing the pre-dawn stillness. It commenced 3 days later. The children were outside, diligently gathering wild onions, when Clay stepped onto the porch and froze, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. Marbeth followed his line of sight and saw it, a glint of metal on the far ridge, a fleeting flash, as if a signal had been sent. Then another 2 riders appeared, and possibly more following behind them. He moved swiftly back inside the cabin. Marbeth did not question him. She calmly gathered the children, her voice steady despite the frantic racing of her pulse. Clay secured the door and retrieved the rifle from its hiding place behind the stove, then handed her the pistol he had concealed beneath the floorboards. "They are here for me," he stated, his voice grim, "but they will have to come through you to reach me." "We will not allow that to happen," she replied with equal resolve. He nodded, his eyes hardening. "Do you recall how to fire it?" "I remember enough," she confirmed. He looked at her for a long, searching moment, as if imprinting her image onto his memory. Then he kissed her deeply, a confident, fear-free embrace, and turned back towards the door. The approaching riders crested the hill just as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, and this time there would be no retreating. The riders descended the ridge at a measured pace, as if they had an abundance of time. There were now 3 of them, 2 in the lead, lean and predatory like wolves who had tasted blood and found it to be a memorable experience, and a third following behind, cloaked in a duster, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low. The third rider sat his mount with an easy posture, his reins loose. However, there was something about the way his horse held its head steady, trained with the disciplined precision of a soldier's steed, that caused Clay to stiffen. Marbeth watched from the shadowed confines of the window, the pistol cradled in her palm, her hand remarkably steady. Clara slept peacefully in her cradle, swaddled securely, entirely unaware that the atmosphere had dramatically shifted, and the very ground beneath them now seemed to anticipate the spilling of blood. Joanna sat close to the hearth, with Matthew nestled against her side, both of them utterly still, silent as stone. It was not the silence of fear, but rather a testament to their obedience and their profound trust. They had witnessed Clay's capabilities and the formidable strength Marbeth possessed, and that was more than sufficient for them. Clay stood resolutely on the porch as the riders entered the clearing. He had deliberately chosen this spot, ensuring the light would be behind him, casting his figure in a silhouette that appeared tall, broad, and inscrutable. A wise man would not reveal his hand too early. A prudent individual would wait for the wind to indicate its allegiance. The lead rider, a man whose cheeks were hollowed, perhaps from prolonged hunger or sheer habit, reined in his horse. "It's been a considerable time, Maddox." Clay did not falter. "That name is buried." "Perhaps so," the rider conceded, "but ghosts have a peculiar way of walking." The second man leaned forward in his saddle, his gaze fixed intently on the cabin. "We heard you'd acquired yourself a family, or perhaps they acquired you." The man in the duster remained silent. Clay lowered one hand towards the porch railing, though he did not touch the rifle resting within easy reach. "You've made your presence known. What happens now?" The hollow-cheeked man offered a grin. "What now? We settle what you left unfinished. EMTT Finch's gold. You took the lion's share and left the rest of us to face our demise." "I left you alive," Clay responded, his voice taut with conviction. "That was the mercy I extended, and you believe mercy buys silence?" "No," Clay replied calmly, "but I believe bullets still carry the same price." The man in the duster finally dismounted. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace. His face was largely obscured by shadow, but as he stepped into the faint light, Marbeth discerned a jawline marked by a scar, cracked and weathered like ancient wood, and eyes of a pale blue, unnervingly tranquil. "You do not recall me, do you?" the man inquired, his voice thin and reedy. "I remember you. I recall witnessing you inflict a grievous wound upon my brother's abdomen outside of Red Hollow, abandoning him to cry out in the dust." Clay's voice remained steady. "If I fired upon him, he provided ample justification. He was 16 years of age." Clay's jaw clenched. He offered no reply. The man produced a smile. "For 10 years I have anticipated your suffering, and so here we are." Marbeth shifted, then moved silently across the cabin's floor. She bestowed a gentle kiss upon Clara's brow, murmured words only a mother would comprehend, then knelt by the doorframe and brought the pistol's hammer back with a sound so faint it seemed the world had never before registered such quietude. Outside, the foremost individual reached for his sidearm. Clay did not hesitate. His rifle discharged with a singular report, and the man with sunken cheeks tumbled backward from his saddle as if he were a mere burlap sack of grain. Before the others could react, Clay dropped to one knee, operated the rifle's action, and fired again. The second man's shoulder erupted in a spray of crimson, and he collapsed with a pained cry, thrashing in the grass. However, the man clad in the duster remained unmoved. He advanced, drawing his revolver with a deliberate, unhurried motion. "You always possessed exceptional speed," he remarked, "but I have no interest in a contest of arms." He fired, not at Clay, but directly into the cabin. The projectile tore through the wooden siding, splintering timbers mere inches from where Marbeth was concealed. She winced, but did not retreat. Instead, she rose with fluid grace, opened the door with her free hand, and discharged her weapon twice. The initial shot missed its mark. The second struck the duster-clad man in the leg. He roared in agony and fell, his firearms skittering across the ground. Clay was already in motion. He sprang from the porch and covered the distance in mere moments. His boot slammed down upon the fallen revolver before the man could reclaim it. "Proceed," the assailant gasped. "End my life. You have committed far worse deeds." Clay stood over him, rifle held ready, his finger poised on the trigger, yet he did not fire. "My intention was not to revert to the person I once was," he stated. "However, you actively sought out that former self." From within the cabin, Marbeth emerged, her firearm still aimed. "He posed a direct threat to our sanctuary." Clay cast one final glance downwards, then turned away. "Remove yourselves from this territory, crawl if you must. Should I ever witness your presence again, my restraint will vanish." The man spat a stream of blood, but offered no resistance. Clay did not wait for him to begin his departure. The second assailant was still conscious, clutching his severely wounded shoulder. Marbeth stood over him for a brief interval, her weapon held steadily, then turned her gaze toward Clay. "What is our next course of action?" she inquired. Clay met her gaze. "We shall enter the first man. The remaining individuals will be sent back in a state of defeat." She offered a single nod. It was Joanna who stepped forward next, holding her younger sibling's hand. Both children's eyes were wide with apprehension as they surveyed the scene of men and spilled blood. Marbeth knelt beside them. "The ordeal has concluded now. Will they return?" Joanna inquired. Marbeth looked to Clay, and he conveyed a negative response with a shake of his head. "No," she assured them, "not again." They interred the man whom Clay had slain at the periphery of the woods, positioned a considerable distance from their dwelling. They did not place him near the other burial sites. Those consecrated grounds were reserved for family members. No words were spoken, no markers were erected, only profound silence and the gentle sound of shovels disturbing damp earth prevailed. Subsequently, Clay stood beside the running stream, cleansing the blood from his hands, his rifle resting nearby. Marbeth joined him, her arms folded against the persistent wind. "That was the conclusive engagement," she remarked. "Every man capable of seeking retribution against me is either deceased or thoroughly incapacitated. Then it is truly finished." Clay turned to face her, his expression revealing an openness rarely seen. "Do you believe I am deserving of tranquility?" Marbeth reached up, her thumb gently caressing his cheek. "You have unquestionably earned it." The following day, they meticulously packed the children and Clara into the wagon and commenced their journey to the settlement, not the original settlement. This new location lay further south, where the thoroughfare broadened, the trees grew sparser, and a proper mercantile establishment stood, boasting genuine glass windows. Marbeth acquired lengths of fabric for new dresses, nails required for the construction of the new barn, sugar intended for spring pies, and a vivid red ribbon for Joanna, who exhibited such unbridled delight that it conjured the sensation of summer arriving ahead of schedule. Clay remained positioned near the public notice board, observing her as she meticulously counted coins and engaged in bartering with an air of self-assurance that belied any prior desperation. When she directed her gaze back towards him, he did not avert his own. That evening, they resumed their positions on the porch, fireflies intermittently illuminating the tall grass, Clara slumbering peacefully in Marbeth's embrace, while the children inside generated a joyous clamour befitting 10 youngsters. "I have never divulged the reason behind my utterance of your name on that inaugural occasion," he stated softly. Marbeth regarded him, the memory surfacing like wisps of smoke behind her eyes. "And what was the reason?" Clay's countenance shifted, displaying something akin to profound wonder. "Because I had heard it within a dream many years prior, following the conflict. I lay upon a battlefield, half conscious, and I distinctly heard a woman speak my name, her voice remarkably soft, like a whispered prayer. And then she revealed her own name, Marbeth. She blinked, taken aback by the revelation. I presumed it was a figment of my imagination until I observed you standing there with those children, gazing at me, as if you inherently recognized that I posed no threat to you." "I was unaware of that," she murmured. "Not truly." "You were aware," he asserted. "You had simply forgotten." Marbeth leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "Then, I suppose we were destined to recall it together." They remained in that embrace for an extended period until the stars intensified their glow and the land settled into a profound quietude, the world gradually returning to its natural equilibrium. The cabin behind them was no longer merely a place of refuge. It represented a cherished memory, a solemn promise and irrefutable evidence of their enduring bond. And in the prevailing stillness, amidst the gentle hum of insects and the soft murmur of the wind, Marbeth uttered a final heartfelt supplication. However, this time it was not a plea, but an expression of gratitude. Spring arrived with its characteristic resilience, its advance slow and uncertain, as though the very earth had grown apprehensive after enduring numerous severe winters. The snow receded in scattered patches, unveiling damp soil and nascent green shoots akin to softly spoken assurances. The trees adorned themselves with buds, the air gradually warmed, and each succeeding morning heralded a chorus of bird song amplified from the one preceding it. Yet it was not solely the meteorological conditions that were undergoing a transformation. The very cadence of their existence was subtly shifting, much like soil that has been undisturbed for years, now being gently turned. Marbeth began rising earlier, not out of compulsion or apprehension, but by her own deliberate choice. Clara stirred beside her in the cradle, her cheeks flushed with the vestiges of sleep, and Marbeth would pause for a brief moment of quiet contemplation before slipping from beneath the quilt, drawing her shawl snugly around herself and stepping out into the crisp morning air. There she would invariably find Clay already engaged in his work, methodically stacking chopped wood, meticulously inspecting the fencing, or repairing the barn's slightly sagging door. He was a profoundly different man from the one who had stood in shadow on that initial night, silent and inscrutable. The solitary figure of the mountainside had softened, not in his inherent strength, but in his overall demeanor. His eyes retained their characteristic glacial grey stillness, but they now frequently rested upon her, no longer solely scanning the distant horizon. He also spoke more frequently, not in voluble pronouncements, but in measured words that artfully filled the voids that had once resonated with an oppressive silence. He would occasionally emit a laugh, and when his lips curved into a smile, it was as if observing the thawing of the earth as it gave way to blossoming life. The children had also undergone a noticeable transformation. Joanna, whose young shoulders had previously borne burdens far beyond her years, now emanated unrestrained laughter. She would ascend trees with agile ease, assist Clay in meticulously tying new fishing lines, and at times even momentarily forget to glance apprehensively over her shoulder. Matthew began to speak again, far more than he had ever done previously. His voice, high-pitched and imbued with an insatiable curiosity, was perpetually posing questions regarding birds, the formation of clouds, the fundamental principles of combustion, and the reasons why trees appeared to slumber throughout the winter months. He had developed a habit of following Clay like an ever-present shadow, mirroring his gait, the manner in which he grasped his tools, and even the subtle frown that creased his brow when an endeavour did not proceed as planned. And then there was Marbeth. She too had evolved, not through a process of reconstruction, but rather a profound rebirth. Her sorrow had not vanished. It had merely receded to the periphery, yielding space for other sentiments to flourish. She now wore her wedding band, suspended from a slender cord, kept close to her heart, yet no longer clutched with the desperation of a life-saving apparatus. Her posture had become more upright, her voice carried a newfound steadiness, and although the ache of loss still lingered at the edges of her consciousness, it no longer dictated the direction of her movements. Love had not supplanted grief, it had simply walked in tandem with it. One morning, she discovered Clay standing at the nascent edge of the garden they had begun to cultivate from the recently thawed earth, his gaze fixed intently on the expanse of trees beyond. He held an object in his hand, an aged envelope, yellowed with time and folded into quarters. She gently touched his elbow. "What is that?" Clay did not respond immediately. When he eventually spoke, his voice was softer than its usual timbre. "It's from years ago, before I arrived here. A letter from a man with whom I previously rode. He once advised me that if I ever wished to relinquish my past, I should seek out a place where my name held no recognition. She glanced at the letter, then back at him. "And did you?" He nodded. "I made an attempt, but the past proved to be an inescapable companion. Perhaps," she suggested gently, "but you did not flee from it when it inevitably found you. You stood your ground. You safeguarded us." "I took a man's life," Clay stated, his jaw tightening. "You preserved a family," she countered. "That is the recollection I shall cherish. That is what the children will remember." He then turned slowly and looked at her in that particular way he had when mere words were insufficient to convey his feelings. "I had never envisioned myself becoming part of something again." "You did not merely become part of something," Marbeth declared. "You became everything." He then embraced her openly, his arms encircling her with a palpable sense of reverence, and she leaned into him, her face pressed against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of a heart that had once known only the harshness of conflict and the untamed wilderness, now beating with a consistent tempo in harmony with their shared home. That evening, Joanna and Matthew assisted in planting the initial rows of potatoes, while Clay diligently turned the soil for the tomato plants. Clara gurgled contentedly on a blanket nestled in the shade of the porch, her small fists batting at the air as if catching invisible moments of pure joy. Marbeth laundered linens and hung them upon the line, her dress billowing gently in the breeze, her smile soft and genuine. Later, after partaking in supper, which consisted of cornbread and stew followed by the season's inaugural apple pie, they gathered around the warmth of the fire. Clay meticulously carved a small wooden horse for Matthew, his hands steady and assured. Joanna read aloud from a well-worn book, her voice occasionally faltering but filled with a determined spirit. Marbeth nursed Clara, softly humming a tuneless melody. It was not an existence of grandeur, nor one of absolute perfection, but it was a life characterized by honesty and hard-won contentment. That night, after the children had been settled into their beds and the fire had dwindled to embers, Clay and Marbeth once again occupied their customary seats on the porch, a ritual that had become as natural as the act of breathing. The stars were densely scattered across the vast expanse above, the sky appearing deep and immeasurable. He turned to her. "I have been contemplating something." She offered a gentle smile, a perilous undertaking. He emitted a low chuckle. "Perhaps, but I believe this land possesses the potential for more than just providing shelter. We could expand our dwelling, perhaps construct an additional room, acquire a few livestock, such as chickens and a dairy cow, and possibly even open the pathway for travelers passing through during the winter months." She raised an eyebrow inquisitively. "You are suggesting we welcome strangers into our vicinity?" He offered a casual shrug. "Not all strangers remain estranged. Some arrive seeking refuge, only to find kinship." Maribeth's eyes held a newfound sparkle. "You desire a life here. I desire one with you," he stated, his voice steady. She extended her hand. "Then we shall construct it together." He drew near, planting a gentle kiss upon her lips. It was not a kiss of haste, but one imbued with a solemn vow. It was a kiss that pledged his permanence, a declaration that the past held no dominion over their shared future. This woman, this porch, these children, this very earth, they were his, unequivocally. As the days unfolded, the dwelling grew livelier, filled with the joyous sounds of laughter. The land flourished, yielding its bounty. By the zenith of summer, talk of marriage began, not with elaborate ceremonies or officiants, but with intertwined hands clasped across a table and affections whispered beneath the canopy of stars. Clay fashioned a ring from tarnished silver, meticulously shaping it by the flickering firelight, polishing it until it gleamed as if spun from pure illumination. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, she was overcome with emotion, tears streaming not from sorrow, but from a profound happiness that transcended words, manifesting only as hushed breaths and trembling hands. And so it was that the woman who had ventured into the desolate wilderness with 2 young children and a heart burdened by profound grief discovered not merely sanctuary, not merely survival, but a profound sense of grace, a redemption forged in adversity and softened by devoted affection. The man she had acquired for the sum of $1 had cost her nothing, yet had bestowed upon her everything. And though the wind continued to rage through the trees on certain nights, and shadows occasionally stirred just beyond the perimeter of the light, there was always the comforting sound of an infant's coo, a boy's boisterous laughter, a girl's sweet melody, and the low, unwavering hum of two voices, inextricably entwined, weaving a future from the remnants of what once was. They had transcended their individual identities. They had become a dwelling, a unit, a narrative worthy of remembrance. Summer's embrace deepened across the valley, and with each passing day the spectre of old fears seemed to diminish, their sharp edges blunted. Life, though not without its imperfections, had found its rhythm. Maribeth still occasionally awoke in the night, her heart racing from dreams she couldn't fully recall, and Clay still habitually kept the rifle near the door, more out of ingrained reflex than immediate necessity. Yet the cabin no longer felt like a clandestine refuge. It now signified a fresh start. Together they erected a chicken coop, their amusement mounting as the initial flock proved stubbornly recalcitrant to confinement. Matthew transformed the task of recapturing the errant fowl into an engaging game, while Joanna, with beaming pride, assumed the role of chief egg collector, each morning approaching her duty as if unearthing precious jewels. Clay enlarged the modest barn, working diligently alongside Maribeth when she wasn't attending to the infant. He meticulously carved a rocking chair for the porch, its surface as smooth as water-worn stone, and she would spend countless evenings there, cradling Clara, softly humming as the sky transformed into a breathtaking canvas of orange and gold. One afternoon, a solitary rider appeared on the winding trail. A woman adorned with a wide-brimmed hat, her saddle bearing the marks of extensive travel, her horse dusted from the journey. Clay's posture tensed, his instincts on high alert, but the woman extended a welcoming hand. "My name is Lorna," she introduced herself. "I passed through this region 10 years ago. I recall this cabin." Maribeth met her on the porch. "It is ours now." Lorna's smile was gentle. "I can see that. It appears different, improved." They shared coffee and conversation beneath the eaves, while Clay maintained a watchful presence from a distance. Lorna spoke of newly opened routes, the rapid expansion of a nearby settlement, and even murmurs of a new railway line being laid miles to the south. However, it was her hushed remark that truly captured Maribeth's attention. "People out there are searching for desirable, secure locations. A woman like yourself, with land and resilience. You could be more than just a provider of shelter, you could be a sanctuary." After Lorna departed, her words continued to resonate. Clay found Maribeth later at the table, her brow furrowed as she studied a map. "Are you contemplating inviting others?" she inquired. She nodded slowly. "Not all at once, perhaps one by one. Women like I once was, with small children and nowhere to turn." He pulled up a chair, sat beside her, and placed his hand over hers. "Then we shall construct additional rooms." That evening she penned her first correspondence since arriving in the mountains. It was brief, a few lines entrusted to Lorna for delivery when she passed through again. It read, "If you know a mother who has nothing left but the resolve to begin anew, send her northward. There is ample space here, there is hope." By the arrival of autumn, another woman appeared, young and apprehensive, a toddler perched on her hip. Maribeth greeted her with bread still warm from the oven, while Clay diligently transformed the old shed into a secondary dwelling. More would follow. The mountains would soon resound with more than the mere whisper of the wind. In time, the trail that once led to desolation would evolve into something far greater, a lifeline, a haven where sorrow encountered healing, a place where fractured spirits were mended, a place where a pregnant widow, having sought out a mountain man for a mere $1, laid the foundation for a legacy immeasurable in value.